Hello and welcome. I'm glad you're here. Tonight, there's nothing you need to focus on, nothing you need to remember, and nowhere you need to go. This is a gentle, slow journey through the history of ancient Mesopotamia, told calmly and softly, so you can relax, unwind, or simply drift off to sleep. Make yourself comfortable, and when you're ready, we'll begin. Close your eyes now, and let yourself drift back through time. Back through thousands of years, to a place where human civilization first began to take shape. A place of rivers and reeds, of sun-baked earth and whispering palms. We're traveling tonight to Mesopotamia. Mesopotamia. Even the word itself has a gentle rhythm to it. It comes from ancient Greek words meaning the land between the rivers. And that's exactly what it was. A long, fertile stretch of land cradled between two great rivers, the Tigris and the Euphrates. These rivers flowed down from distant mountains, carrying with them the gift of water through an otherwise harsh and unforgiving landscape. Imagine standing there, in that ancient land, thousands of years ago. The sun beats down from a cloudless sky. The air shimmers with heat. Without those rivers, this would be desert, dry, barren, inhospitable. But the rivers changed everything. They brought life. They brought possibility. The rivers were not always gentle friends, though. They flooded unpredictably, sometimes with devastating force. Unlike the Nile in Egypt, which flooded at regular, dependable times, the Tigris and Euphrates were wild and temperamental. They might overflow their banks violently in the spring, washing away homes and fields. Or they might barely rise at all, leaving the land parched and crops withering. But when the floods came, they left behind something precious. Silt. Rich, dark, fertile silt that settled across the fields like a blessing. This silt, carried down from the mountains far upstream, was full of nutrients. It made the soil incredibly fertile. In this gift of silt, the people of Mesopotamia found opportunity. To survive in this challenging environment, the ancient Mesopotamians had to become innovators. They had to work with the rivers, to tame them somehow, to harness their power while protecting against their fury. And so they began to dig. They dug irrigation canals, channels that would carry water from the rivers out to their fields. These weren't simple ditches. They were carefully planned, carefully engineered waterways that spread across the landscape like veins, bringing life-giving water exactly where it was needed. They built dikes to hold back the floodwaters. They constructed levees along the riverbanks, earthen walls that would protect their settlements when the rivers rose. Every spring, they would reinforce these barriers, piling up mud and reeds, working together as communities because no single family could manage this alone. The water united them. It made cooperation necessary. It made civilization possible. For lifting water from the canals to fields that sat higher than the water level, they invented a device called the shaduf. Picture a long pole balanced on a vertical post, like a seesaw. On one end hung a bucket, and on the other end, a counterweight, perhaps a large stone or a ball of dried mud. A farmer could pull down the bucket end, dip it into the canal, and then let the counterweight help lift the heavy, water-filled bucket back up. Then they'd swing the pole and pour the water where it was needed. It was simple, efficient, elegant. And you can still see shadufs in use today, in some parts of the world, unchanged after thousands of years. The Mesopotamians also developed early forms of the plow. Before plows, people used simple digging sticks to break the soil. But the Mesopotamians created the ord, a wooden implement, often pulled by oxen, that could scratch furrows through the earth much more efficiently. Later, they developed something even more ingenious, the seed plough. This was an oar with a funnel attached, so that as the plough cut its furrow through the soil, seeds could be dropped through the funnel directly into the ground. One pass, and you'd ploughed and planted at once. It was a remarkable innovation, one that allowed them to farm much larger areas and feed growing populations. Life in ancient Mesopotamia followed the rhythms of the seasons, the rhythms of the rivers. There was a time for planting, when the floods had receded and the soil was soft and rich. There was a time for tending the crops, for maintaining the canals, for watching the barley and wheat grow tall under the relentless sun. There was a time for harvest, for gathering in the grain that would sustain the community through the coming year. And there was a time for preparing, for strengthening the dikes and levees before the floods came again. This rhythm, this close connection to water and soil and season, shaped everything about Mesopotamian life. It shaped their religion, they worshipped gods of storms and rivers and fertility. It shaped their social structure, cooperation was essential, and organization necessary. It shaped their innovations, every problem demanded a solution, and solutions required ingenuity. And from this relationship with the land and water, something remarkable began to emerge. In southern Mesopotamia, where the two rivers flowed closest together before emptying into the Persian Gulf, small settlements began to appear. At first, these were simple villages, clusters of reed huts where families lived and farmed together. But over time, some of these settlements began to grow. They grew larger than villages. They became something new. They became cities. Eridu was one of the first. According to later Mesopotamian tradition, Eridu was the very first city ever built, created by the gods themselves at the beginning of time. Whether or not it was truly the first, Eridu was certainly ancient, among the oldest continuously inhabited places in all of Mesopotamia. Archaeologists have found layer upon layer of occupation there, stretching back into the 5th millennium before the Common Era. Then there was Uruk. Uruk grew to become one of the greatest cities of the ancient world. By around 3000 BCE, Uruk might have been home to 50,000 people or more, an astonishing number for that time. It was a place of temples and palaces, of craftsmen and priests, of scribes learning to write humanity's first written words. And Ur, the city of Ur, with its magnificent monuments and royal tombs. Ur would later become the center of an empire, a place of wealth and power, its influence spreading across all of Mesopotamia. These cities rose in the 4th millennium BCE, that period between 4000 and 3000 years before the Common Era. They represented something genuinely new in human history. Yes, people had lived in villages before. Yes, they had farmed and built houses. But cities were different. Cities were larger, more complex, more organized. They required planning, administration, hierarchy. They required specialization, not everyone could be a farmer anymore. Some people became potters, focusing all their energy on making the best possible pottery. Others became metalworkers, or weavers, or priests, or scribes. The buildings in these early cities were made primarily of mud brick. Stone was scarce in southern Mesopotamia, there were no quarries nearby, no mountains to mine. But there was mud, endless mud from the rivers and canals. And mud, when shaped into bricks and dried in the hot sun, became hard and strong. It wasn't permanent like stone, mud brick slowly erodes, especially in rain, and buildings required constant maintenance. But it was abundant and workable, and the Mesopotamians became masters at using it. They built thick city walls from mud brick, walls that protected against raiders and floods alike. These walls proclaimed the city's power and independence. They separated the civilized space inside from the wild lands beyond. Within the walls, streets wound between houses and workshops. Neighborhoods developed, each with its own character, its own temples, its own sense of community. And at the heart of many Mesopotamian cities rose something distinctive and remarkable, the ziggurat. The ziggurat was a massive stepped pyramid, built from millions of mud bricks. Unlike the smooth-sided pyramids of Egypt, ziggurats rose in stages, like a wedding cake, each level smaller than the one below. A long stairway or ramp led up the side, climbing from level to level, until it reached the small temple at the very top. These were not tombs. They were temples, but more than temples, they were mountains. Remember, southern Mesopotamia is flat. There are no hills, no mountains visible on the horizon. But the Mesopotamians remembered mountains. Their earliest ancestors had come from the mountainous lands to the north and east. Mountains were sacred in their traditions, places where heaven and earth met, where the gods might dwell. So they built artificial mountains. They built ziggurats. At the top, in the small temple, the city's patron god or goddess was thought to reside. Priests would climb the long stairs to make offerings, to perform rituals, to tend to the deity's needs. The ziggurat was the center of the city, visible from miles away, dominating the skyline. It was a symbol of the city's wealth and devotion, a connection point between the human and divine realms. The ziggurat said, "We are here. We have built something permanent. We have created a place for the gods among us. We are civilized. We are powerful. We are a city." And so, from the rivers and the silt, from the canals and the seed plows, from the cooperation required to manage water and build walls, from all of this emerged these first cities. Eridu and Uruk and Ur, and others too, Lagash and Nippur and Kish. Each with its own ziggurat pointing toward heaven. Each with its neighborhoods and temples and workshops. Each with its farmers in the surrounding fields, growing the barley and wheat that fed the growing population. Civilization was beginning. Slowly, gradually, like a plant pushing through soil toward the sun, it was taking root in the land between the rivers. Let that image rest in your mind now. The rivers flowing, eternal and powerful. The fields green with growing grain. The cities rising from the plain, mud brick walls golden in the evening light. The ziggurats reaching upward, step by step, toward the infinite sky. Mesopotamia. The land between the rivers. Where it all began. Rest now. Let yourself drift, like a leaf floating on the gentle current of the Euphrates. We have much more to discover together, but there's no hurry. There's all the time in the world. As these first cities took shape along the rivers, as people gathered together in growing numbers behind mud brick walls, they brought with them their gods. Or perhaps it's better to say, the gods were already there, waiting. Because to the ancient Mesopotamians, the world was absolutely alive with divine presence. The gods weren't distant or abstract. They were here, now, everywhere. This was a polytheistic world, a world of many gods, countless gods. There wasn't one supreme deity ruling alone from some remote heaven. Instead, divinity was multiple, diverse, present in every aspect of existence. There were great gods who shaped the cosmos and determined fate. There were lesser gods who managed specific aspects of life. There were spirits dwelling in rivers and fields. There were demons lurking in dark places, causing illness and misfortune. Every city had its own patron deity, a god or goddess who was thought to literally own that city, to dwell there, to protect it and bless it. The relationship between a city and its patron god was intimate and essential. The city existed to serve its god. The people built temples for the god to inhabit, offered daily sacrifices, performed rituals to keep the deity content. In return, the god defended the city, ensured the fertility of its fields, granted it prosperity and power. At Ur, that ancient city we mentioned earlier, the patron god was Nana, also called Sin. Nana was the moon god, and his symbol was the crescent moon. Imagine living in Ur, watching that crescent moon rise in the night sky, and knowing that you were seeing the symbol of your city's divine protector. The great ziggurat at Ur was Nana's house, his dwelling place on earth. Every night, as the moon traveled across the heavens, the people of Ur felt the presence of their god watching over them. Nippur was the city of Enlil, one of the greatest and most powerful gods in the Mesopotamian pantheon. Enlil was the god of wind and storm, of air and breath. But more than that, Enlil was the king of the gods, the one who determined destinies, who made the great decisions that shaped the world. Nippur, as Enlil's city, held special importance. Even when other cities grew more politically powerful, Nippur remained the religious center of Mesopotamia, the place where Enlil's authority was recognized by all. At Uruk, that largest and most magnificent of early cities, the patron goddess was Inanna, later known as Ishtar. Inanna was complex, multifaceted, goddess of love and sensuality, but also goddess of war and conflict. She was the morning and evening star, the planet Venus blazing in the dawn and dusk skies. She was passionate, fierce, unpredictable. Her myths portray her as demanding, proud, powerful, willing to fight gods and humans alike to get what she wanted. The people of Uruk honored her with elaborate festivals and rituals, and her temple was one of the wonders of the ancient world. But these three, Nana, Enlil, and Inanna, were just the beginning. The Mesopotamian divine world was vast and intricate. There was Anu, the sky god, father of gods, whose name meant simply heaven. Anu was remote, dignified, somewhat distant from human affairs, ruling from his celestial palace. There was Enki, god of fresh water, of wisdom, of magic and crafts. Enki dwelt in the Abzu, the underground ocean of fresh water that the Mesopotamians believed existed beneath the earth. He was clever, sometimes mischievous, often helping humanity with his knowledge and ingenuity. Many myths portray Enki as humanity's friend and protector, the god who gave people the gifts of civilization. There were hundreds more. Gods of sun and storm, of grain and beer, of writing and brick-making. Every craft had its divine patron. Every force of nature had its deity. The Mesopotamians lived in a world that was, at every moment, infused with divine presence and divine will. This wasn't necessarily comforting. The gods were powerful but not always benevolent. They had their own desires, their own conflicts, their own moods. They might bless you one day and curse you the next. They demanded constant attention, constant offerings. The rituals had to be performed correctly, the sacrifices given properly, or the gods might withdraw their favor. And beyond the gods, there were other beings. Spirits and demons, some helpful, many dangerous. There were protective spirits that might guard a household. There were disease demons that brought fever and pain. There were ghosts of the restless dead. The world was crowded with unseen presences, and wise people took care not to offend them. Religion in Mesopotamia wasn't separate from daily life. It was woven through everything, through farming and commerce, through law and kingship, through art and literature. Before there were kings claiming political authority, there were priests serving the gods. The temples came first. The temples were the centers of the earliest cities, and political power grew up around them, justified by them. This brings us to the question, how did the Mesopotamians understand the order of the cosmos? How did they explain why things were the way they were? They told stories. Beautiful, powerful stories that explained the origins of the world and the nature of divine authority. One of the most important of these stories is called the Enuma Elish, which means, when on high, the opening words of the poem. This creation epic was recited during the Great New Year festival in Babylon, probably dating to the early 2nd millennium BCE, though it may contain much older traditions. The Enuma Elish tells of a time before anything existed as we know it now. In the beginning, there were only two primordial beings, Apsu, the fresh water, and Tiamat, the salt water. These two mingled together, and from their union, the first gods were born. But these younger gods were noisy, restless, disturbing the peace of the primordial waters. Apsu grew irritated and decided to destroy them. However, the wise god Enki discovered this plan and put Apsu into a deep sleep, then killed him. This solved one problem but created another, because Tiamat was enraged by the death of her partner. She prepared for war against the younger gods, creating monsters to be her army, serpents and dragons, scorpion men, and other terrifying creatures. The gods were afraid. Who could stand against Tiamat and her monstrous forces? Then young Marduk, son of Enki, stepped forward. Marduk was a storm god, associated with the city of Babylon. He offered to fight Tiamat, but on one condition: if he won, he must be made king of all the gods. The frightened deities agreed. Marduk armed himself with weapons of storm and wind. He caught Tiamat in a net, and when she opened her mouth to devour him, he drove fierce winds into her belly, filling her until she was bloated and helpless. Then he shot an arrow into her, splitting her heart. Tiamat died, and Marduk stood victorious. But he wasn't finished. He took Tiamat's corpse and split it in two, like opening a shellfish. From one half he made the sky. From the other half he made the earth. From her tears he made the Tigris and Euphrates rivers. From her bones and flesh he fashioned the physical world as we know it. Then the gods celebrated. They built Babylon as Marduk's city and constructed a great temple for him there. And they created humanity, from the blood of Chingu, one of Tiamat's allies, to serve the gods, to work the fields and maintain the temples so the gods could rest. This story did many things. It explained the origin of the world, yes. It explained the rivers, the sky, the earth. But it also did something more: it justified kingship and social order. Marduk became king not through birthright but through his strength and courage, through defeating chaos and establishing order. The story suggested that legitimate authority comes from the ability to create and maintain order against the forces of chaos. And humans, in this story, were created specifically to serve the gods. This wasn't presented as slavery or oppression, but as humanity's purpose, the reason we exist. The Mesopotamians didn't see this as demeaning. If anything, it gave human life meaning and importance. The gods needed us. We had a role in maintaining cosmic order. The Anunnaki were another crucial element in Mesopotamian cosmic understanding. The Anunnaki were a group of the most powerful gods, sometimes described as the offspring of Anu. They were the fate decreers, the ones who determined destinies. They met in assembly to make the great decisions that shaped the world. They decided which cities would rise and which would fall. They determined how long a king would reign. They set the boundaries of human life. Fate, in Mesopotamian thought, was real and powerful. Once the Anunnaki decreed something, it would happen. Not even the gods could easily change a fate once decreed. This gave the world a sense of order, but also a tragic quality. Some things were simply determined, fixed, unavoidable. Yet the universe had regions the great gods didn't rule. There was the underworld, the land of the dead, called Akkad or Kur. This was a dark, gloomy place beneath the earth, from which no one returned. It was ruled by the goddess Ereshkigal, whose name meant Lady of the Great Place Below. The underworld in Mesopotamian belief wasn't exactly a place of punishment, like later concepts of hell. Everyone went there when they died, good and bad alike. It was simply the land of the dead, a dim reflection of life above. The dead existed there as shadows, eating dust and clay, dwelling in darkness. It was a somber, melancholy fate. But there's a remarkable myth about a goddess who descended to that realm and returned, the myth of Inanna's descent. Inanna, the proud goddess of Uruk, decided to visit the underworld. Why? The reasons vary in different versions, perhaps to attend a funeral, perhaps to conquer death itself, perhaps out of curiosity or ambition. Whatever the reason, she descended. The underworld had 7 gates, and at each gate, Inanna had to remove one of her royal garments or divine powers. Her crown, her jewels, her royal robe, her breastplate. One by one, she was stripped of everything that made her mighty, until she arrived before Ereshkigal naked and powerless. Ereshkigal and the judges of the underworld killed Inanna and hung her corpse on a hook. And that should have been the end. But Inanna had been wise enough to arrange help before descending. Her servant went to Enki, the wise god, who created beings from the dirt under his fingernails, creatures neither living nor dead, who could enter the underworld without dying. These beings descended and sprinkled Inanna's corpse with the water of life and the food of life, and she revived. But there was a rule: no one could leave the underworld unless they provided a replacement. Demons accompanied Inanna back to the surface, seeking someone to take her place. She found her husband, Dumuzi, sitting comfortably on her throne, not mourning her at all. Enraged, she decreed that he would be her replacement. The demons dragged Dumuzi down to the realm of death. Eventually, a compromise was reached. Dumuzi would spend half the year in the underworld, and his sister would spend the other half. This myth explained the seasons, the cycles of death and rebirth in nature, the disappearance and return of fertility. But it also showed something important about the Mesopotamian worldview. Even gods could die, at least temporarily. The boundaries between life and death, between the realms, could be crossed, though not without cost. Order and chaos, life and death, were in constant negotiation. These stories, the Enuma Elish, the descent of Inanna, and countless others, weren't just entertainment. They were sacred narratives that explained how the world worked, why society was structured as it was, what humanity's place in the cosmos might be. The gods were first. The cities were built for them. The temples fed them. The kings ruled in their names. Everything else, politics, law, war, peace, flowed from this fundamental religious understanding. Rest now with these ancient gods. Imagine their temples, incense smoke rising into the evening air. Imagine the hymns sung in their honor, the steady rhythm of drums and lyres. Imagine the priests performing their timeless rituals, maintaining the order of the cosmos through their daily service. The gods are present, watching over the land between the rivers. In the city of Uruk, sometime around 3,600 years before the Common Era, something extraordinary happened. Someone pressed a reed stylus into soft clay and made marks that represented not just pictures, but words, ideas, sounds. Language itself, captured and made permanent. This was the invention of writing. And it changed everything. The earliest writing wasn't literature or poetry. It wasn't love letters or stories. It was something much more practical: record keeping. Temple administrators needed to track vast quantities of goods flowing in and out of the temple storehouses. Barley and wheat, jars of oil, bolts of cloth, herds of sheep and goats. Who donated what? What was distributed to whom? What remained in storage? Memory alone couldn't manage this complexity. As cities grew, as economies became more intricate, as temples accumulated wealth and redistributed it, some method of permanent record became essential. And so writing was born from necessity, from the need to remember, to account, to track. The early writing system was pictographic, simple pictures representing objects. A picture of a jar meant jar. A picture of grain meant grain. But these pictures were pressed into clay with a cut reed, and clay doesn't hold fine detail well. Over time, the pictures became more abstract, more stylized. The curved lines became groups of wedge-shaped marks, because that's what a reed naturally creates when pressed into clay. We call this writing cuneiform, from the Latin word cuneus, meaning wedge. These wedge-shaped marks, arranged in different combinations, could represent objects, ideas, and eventually sounds. The system became more sophisticated. A sign might represent a word, or it might represent a syllable that could be used to spell out other words. It became flexible, capable of expressing the full complexity of the Sumerian language, and later, other languages too. Imagine the scribes sitting in the temple courtyards, soft clay tablets before them, reed styluses in hand. They press the marks carefully into the clay, creating permanent records. When finished, the tablets might be dried in the sun or baked in kilns to harden them forever. Thousands upon thousands of these tablets have survived to our time, buried in the ruins of ancient cities, waiting to tell their stories. At first, writing was purely practical. Receipts and inventories, contracts and transactions. But once the technology existed, once humans could capture language in visible form, the possibilities expanded. Writing moved beyond simple accounting. It became a tool for capturing knowledge, for preserving wisdom, for creating literature. Epic poems were written down, stories of heroes and gods that had been told orally for generations could now be preserved exactly, passed down through centuries. Hymns to the gods were recorded. Royal inscriptions proclaimed the deeds of kings. Legal codes were carved in stone, making the law visible and permanent for all to see. Writing transformed how knowledge could be accumulated and transmitted. Before writing, everything had to be remembered, passed person to person, generation to generation, changing slightly each time. With writing, knowledge became stable. It could be studied, compared, built upon. An astronomer could record observations, and another astronomer decades later could read those same observations and add to them. Writing made cumulative knowledge possible. It made civilization, as we understand it, possible. But creating these clay tablets required skill. The cuneiform script was complex, with hundreds of different signs to memorize. Learning to write took years of intensive training. Not everyone could do it. In fact, very few people could. Scribes were trained in special schools called idaba, literally tablet house. Boys, and it seems to have been almost exclusively boys, would enter these schools as children and spend years learning the scribal art. They would copy out practice texts again and again, memorizing the signs, learning proper grammar and spelling, studying the classical texts of their tradition. It was rigorous, demanding work. The scribes themselves left us accounts of their training. We have school texts where students copied out proverbs and wisdom sayings, mathematical problems, lists of signs to memorize. We even have texts that complain about how difficult the work was, how strict the teachers were. Some things never change across the millennia. Those who completed this training became members of an elite profession. Scribes were needed everywhere, in temples to maintain records, in palaces to draft royal correspondence and treaties, in the army to keep track of supplies and troops, in commerce to record contracts and debts. A good scribe could expect respect, decent income, and relative security. Most people, though, could not read or write. Literacy rates in ancient Mesopotamia were very low, probably only a few % of the population could read. This meant that scribes held enormous influence. They were the gatekeepers of knowledge, the interpreters of written law, the recorders of history. What they chose to write down was preserved. What they didn't record was lost. Before writing became common, people needed other ways to mark ownership and authenticate documents. One elegant solution was the cylinder seal. This was a small cylinder of stone, usually an inch or two long, carved with an intricate design or scene. When rolled across soft clay, the seal would leave its impression, a continuous image that was unique to that particular seal. These cylinder seals functioned like signatures. A merchant would seal a container of goods with clay, then roll his cylinder seal across the clay. If the seal arrived unbroken, the container hadn't been tampered with. If a contract was written, the parties would roll their seals on it, authenticating the agreement. Some seals depicted their owner's name in cuneiform, others showed mythological scenes or geometric patterns. The seals were often beautiful works of art, carved with extraordinary skill despite their tiny size. Many depicted gods and heroes, worship scenes, combat with monsters. A person's seal was precious, personal, a mark of identity. They were often worn on cords around the neck or wrist, kept close at all times. While scribes were mastering the art of writing, other specialists were developing another powerful tool, mathematics. The Mesopotamians created a sophisticated mathematical system based on the number 60. We call this the sexagesimal system, from the Latin for 60th. Where we count in tens, they counted in 60s. Why 60? It's a beautifully practical number. 60 can be divided evenly by many other numbers, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 10, 12, 15, 20, 30. This makes calculations and fractions much easier to work with than a system based on 10. We still use the Mesopotamian sexagesimal system today, though we might not realize it. There are 60 seconds in a minute, 60 minutes in an hour. A circle has 360 degrees, that's 6 times 60. These are gifts from ancient Mesopotamia, still structuring how we measure time and space. The Mesopotamians used this mathematical system for practical purposes. Surveying fields to determine their area and calculate taxes. Planning irrigation projects. Designing buildings. Dividing inheritances fairly. Recording commercial transactions. Mathematics pervaded practical life. But they also pursued mathematics for its own sake, as an intellectual challenge. We have clay tablets with complex mathematical problems and solutions, showing that Mesopotamian mathematicians understood sophisticated concepts. They could calculate square roots and cube roots. They knew what we call the Pythagorean theorem, the relationship between the sides of a right triangle, more than 1,000 years before Pythagoras was born. Time itself was measured carefully. The day was divided into 12 double hours, each double hour into 60 minutes. This precision in timekeeping was connected to another great Mesopotamian achievement, astronomy. The Mesopotamians watched the sky with dedicated attention. Night after night, for centuries, they recorded the movements of celestial bodies. The moon, the sun, the 5 visible planets, Mercury, Venus, Mars, Jupiter, and Saturn. They noticed patterns, cycles, regularities in the heavens. They developed a lunar calendar based on the cycles of the moon. Each month began with the new moon, when the crescent first became visible in the western sky at sunset. The month lasted for either 29 or 30 days, until the next new moon. 12 of these lunar months made a year. But there's a problem: 12 lunar months only equal about 354 days, while a solar year, the time it takes the Earth to orbit the Sun, is about 365 days. The seasons depend on the solar year. If you use a purely lunar calendar, the months slowly drift through the seasons. Spring months would gradually become summer months, then fall months, completely disconnected from agricultural realities. The Mesopotamians solved this with intercalary months, extra months added periodically to realign the calendar with the seasons. If spring was arriving too early in the calendar, they'd add an extra month. It wasn't a perfect system initially, but over time they developed sophisticated schemes for knowing exactly when to add these extra months, eventually settling on a regular 19-year cycle. Their astronomical observations grew increasingly precise. They could predict lunar eclipses with remarkable accuracy. They tracked the planets as they moved against the background of stars, noting their complex patterns of motion, how they would move forward, then sometimes appear to stop and move backward for a while before resuming forward motion again. They divided the sky into sections, creating what would eventually evolve into our zodiac. They identified constellations and associated them with gods and mythological figures. The stars weren't just beautiful lights in the darkness, they were messages, omens, part of the divine communication with humanity. When would an eclipse occur? This was crucially important, because eclipses were seen as dire omens, threatening the king's life. Elaborate rituals would be performed during eclipses to protect the ruler. Sometimes a substitute king would even be placed on the throne temporarily during an eclipse, so if disaster struck, the substitute would die instead of the real king. This might sound like superstition to us, but it drove careful, systematic observation. The Mesopotamians created the world's first systematic observational astronomy. They kept records spanning centuries, allowing them to identify long-term patterns and cycles. For precise timekeeping at night, they used water clocks. These were vessels with small holes through which water would drip at a steady rate. By measuring how much water had dripped out, you could tell how much time had passed. These clocks allowed priests to perform night rituals at exactly the right time, to track the hours of darkness, to coordinate their observations of stars rising and setting. The temple rituals often happened at night, under the stars. Hymns sung to the moon god as the crescent rose. Offerings made at specific hours, when particular stars reached certain positions. The priests maintaining the cosmic order through their precisely timed actions, their careful observations, their mathematical calculations. All of this knowledge, the writing, the mathematics, the astronomy, was interconnected. Scribes recorded astronomical observations. Mathematicians calculated planetary positions. Astronomers used water clocks to time their observations and calendrical mathematics to predict eclipses. Knowledge was building, accumulating, growing more sophisticated with each generation. The clay tablets preserved it all, keeping the wisdom safe for those who came after. Picture those scribes in the quiet evening, working by lamplight in temple courtyards. The stylus pressing into clay. The wedge-shaped marks appearing, row after row, recording observations of the moon, calculations of field areas, copies of ancient wisdom texts. Above them, the stars wheel slowly across the night sky, following their eternal paths. The world was being written into clay. Knowledge was being captured, preserved, accumulated. The foundations of science and literature were being laid, one tablet at a time, in the cities between the rivers. Rest now, as the scribes put down their styluses. The water clock drips steadily, marking the peaceful passage of time. The stars shine on, patient and eternal. Sleep well, as the ancient knowledge rests safely in its clay tablets, waiting through the centuries. Let's walk now through the streets of an ancient Mesopotamian city. Not the grand temples or royal palaces we've been visiting, but the neighborhoods where ordinary people lived their daily lives. Let's visit their homes, meet their families, see how they spent their days and nights in this ancient world. The basic unit of society was the family. This was a patriarchal world, where authority typically rested with men, fathers, husbands, eldest sons. The male head of household made important decisions, owned the family property, represented the family in legal matters. This pattern was common across the ancient world, and Mesopotamia was no exception. But within this patriarchal structure, there were nuances, variations, spaces where women could exercise agency and authority. In many Mesopotamian cities, women could own property. A woman might inherit from her father, bringing wealth into her marriage as her own possession, not automatically becoming her husband's property. She might own a house, a field, shares in a business venture. She could buy and sell property, make loans, engage in commerce. Not all women had these opportunities, much depended on social class and specific circumstances, but the legal framework existed for women to participate in economic life. Marriage in Mesopotamia was a formal arrangement, established through contracts. These weren't typically romantic unions based on personal attraction. They were alliances between families, economic partnerships, strategies for producing children and continuing family lines. Marriages were arranged, often when the prospective bride and groom were quite young. The marriage contract would specify the dowry, the property and goods the bride's family would provide. This might include household items, jewelry, sometimes land or silver. The dowry remained the wife's property even after marriage. If her husband died, she could reclaim it. If they divorced, depending on the circumstances, she might take it with her. Yes, divorce existed in Mesopotamia, and the legal codes addressed it in detail. A man could typically divorce his wife more easily than a wife could divorce her husband, that patriarchal structure at work again. But divorce wasn't a simple matter of abandonment. There were procedures, obligations, financial settlements. If a man divorced his wife without proper cause, he might have to return her dowry and pay additional compensation. If a wife was divorced through no fault of her own, she had certain protections. Women could also initiate divorce in some circumstances. The famous law code of Hammurabi, which we'll explore more later, includes provisions for wives who wanted to leave their husbands. If she could prove she had been a dutiful wife but her husband had been abusive or neglectful, she could take her dowry and return to her father's house, free to remarry. Children were precious in Mesopotamian society, essential for continuing the family line, caring for aging parents, and honoring family ancestors with proper rituals after death. Infant and child mortality were high, as they were throughout the ancient world, so families often had many children, knowing that not all would survive to adulthood. Childhood, especially early childhood, was a time of relative freedom. Young children played in the streets and courtyards, probably much like children everywhere, running, laughing, creating games. But as they grew older, education and training began. For most children, education meant learning the family trade. A potter's son would learn pottery, working alongside his father, gradually mastering the craft. A farmer's children would learn farming. A merchant's children would learn commerce. Knowledge and skill passed from generation to generation through direct apprenticeship. For boys from wealthy families, there was another path, the scribal schools we mentioned earlier, the Idaba. This was rigorous formal education, taking years, but offering the possibility of a prestigious career. Girls typically remained at home, learning from their mothers the skills they'd need as wives and household managers, cooking, weaving, perhaps brewing beer, managing servants if the family was wealthy enough to have them. Some daughters of wealthy or priestly families might learn to read and write, though this was unusual. A few women became priestesses, and some priestesses were quite educated and influential. Daily life involved considerable attention to hygiene and grooming, at least for those who could afford it. The Mesopotamians cared about cleanliness and appearance. They bathed regularly, using water from wells or the river. Soap didn't exist as we know it, but they had cleansing agents made from plant ashes mixed with oils. Both men and women wore their hair long, often elaborately styled. Men typically wore beards, carefully groomed and oiled. Hair and beard care was an important part of a man's grooming routine. Shaving or cutting someone's hair could be a punishment or sign of mourning. Cosmetics were used by both men and women, though perhaps more extensively by women. Eye makeup was particularly important, lines of kohl around the eyes, made from ground minerals mixed with oil. This wasn't just vanity. The harsh sun reflecting off the dusty landscape made dark eye makeup practical, reducing glare. But it was also beautiful, dramatic, making the eyes striking and expressive. Women used rouge for their cheeks and lips, made from red ochre or crushed minerals. They had perfumes and scented oils, precious and expensive. A wealthy woman might own beautifully crafted cosmetic boxes and jars, applying her makeup carefully with small applicators and brushes. Clothing was made primarily from wool and linen. The Mesopotamian climate was hot, so garments were designed to provide some coolness while maintaining modesty. Both men and women wore long wrapped or draped garments. The wealthy had finer fabrics, more elaborate styles, more colors. Dyeing cloth was expensive. Common people wore simpler, undyed clothing. Jewelry was treasured by those who could afford it. Necklaces, earrings, bracelets, rings, crafted from gold, silver, copper, bronze, and semi-precious stones. Jewelry was wealth you could wear, portable, valuable, beautiful. A woman's jewelry might constitute most of her personal property. And now let's talk about food, because food was central to daily life, to social relations, to ritual and celebration. The foundation of the Mesopotamian diet was barley. Barley grew well in the irrigated fields, tolerating the somewhat salty soil better than wheat. Barley was ground into flour and baked into bread, round, flat loaves cooked on hot stones or in clay ovens. Bread was eaten at every meal, the fundamental staple that kept people alive. But barley had another crucial use, making beer. Beer in Mesopotamia wasn't quite like modern beer. It was thicker, more nutritious, less alcoholic, often drunk through straws to avoid the grain sediment that floated in it. But it was beer nonetheless, fermented barley that provided calories, vitamins, and a mild pleasant effect that made hard labor more bearable. Beer was brewed primarily by women. This was women's work, specialized knowledge passed from mother to daughter. The process required skill and careful attention. First, barley bread was baked, but only partially. Then this bread was soaked in water, and the mixture was allowed to ferment. Brewing was so important that there was a goddess of beer, Ninkasi, and a beautiful hymn to her that's essentially a recipe for brewing, preserved in cuneiform. Beer wasn't a luxury or indulgence. It was a staple food, consumed daily by everyone, men, women, children. Workers received part of their wages as beer rations. Temple workers were paid partly in beer. The amount and quality of beer you received indicated your status. A laborer might get a couple of liters of ordinary beer per day. An administrator or priest would receive more, and of better quality. Beer was safer to drink than water, since the brewing process killed harmful microorganisms. It was nutritious, providing calories and B vitamins. It was refreshing in the heat. It was social, shared among friends and family. Beer was civilization in a cup. Besides barley and beer, the Mesopotamian diet included a variety of other foods. Vegetables from gardens, onions, leeks, garlic, lentils, chickpeas, lettuce, cucumbers. Date palms provided sweet fruit and palm wine. Fruits like pomegranates, figs, and apples, though these were less common. Fish from the rivers and canals were an important source of protein, especially for common people. Fishermen worked the waters daily, using nets and hooks, catching catfish and carp. Fish might be eaten fresh, or dried and salted for preservation. Herds of sheep and goats provided meat, milk, and cheese, though meat was expensive and most people ate it rarely, perhaps only at festivals. The wealthy could afford meat more regularly, and animals were sacrificed at temples, with portions distributed to worshippers. Pork was known but seems to have been less common. Beef was rare and expensive, reserved for special occasions. Cooking was simple but flavorful. Stews were common, combining grains or legumes with vegetables and occasionally meat, seasoned with herbs and garlic. There were flatbreads, porridges, simple roasted or grilled items. Sesame oil was used for cooking and flavoring. The main meal of the day was typically eaten in the evening, after the day's work was done. The family would gather together, sitting on the floor or on low benches, eating from a shared dish or individual bowls. Hands were washed before eating. Bread served as both food and utensil, used to scoop up stews and porridges. Eating together was important, a time of family connection. But it was more than that. Sharing a meal created bonds, obligations. Hospitality was taken seriously in Mesopotamian culture. If a stranger came to your door, you offered food and drink. To share bread and salt with someone created a relationship, a mutual obligation of protection and goodwill. Wealthy families might host elaborate banquets, with many courses, fine beer and date wine, entertainment with musicians and singers. These were displays of generosity and status, ways of building social networks and political alliances. But for most people, most of the time, eating was simpler. The family around a shared bowl of barley stew. Fresh bread, still warm. Cups of beer passed around. Perhaps some dates for sweetness. Conversation about the day's work, plans for tomorrow, family news, and neighborhood gossip. After the evening meal, as darkness fell and the day's heat finally released its grip on the city, people might sit outside in courtyards or on rooftops to catch any breeze. Children would be put to bed, their sleepy voices quieting. Adults might talk quietly, or work on small tasks by lamplight, mending nets, spinning wool, repairing tools. The night watchmen would begin their rounds through the city streets. Temple fires would be lit, and priests would perform the evening rituals, feeding the gods their evening meal, singing the proper hymns. The gods, too, followed the rhythms of the day, waking, eating, working, resting, just as humans did. And gradually, the sounds of the city would quiet. Voices fading. Lamps extinguishing one by one. The city settling into sleep under the vast star-filled sky. This was daily life in ancient Mesopotamia. Not so different, in many ways, from daily life anywhere. People worked and rested. They cared for their children and their homes. They shared meals with family and friends. They worried about practical things. Will the crops grow? Will the children thrive? Will there be enough? But they did all this in a world of clay and reeds and palm trees, in cities where ziggurats rose toward the heavens, where scribes wrote in wedge-shaped marks, where the gods walked among them. Imagine yourself there now, in that ancient city. The day's work is done. Your family is gathered. There's fresh bread and cool beer. The evening air finally brings relief from the heat. Somewhere nearby, someone is playing a lyre, a gentle melody drifting through the dusk. All is well. Rest now. Let the gentle rhythms of ancient life carry you into peaceful sleep. As the sun rose each morning over the cities of Mesopotamia, the streets would come alive with activity. This was a world of work, of skilled hands creating the objects and goods that sustained civilization. Let's walk through the city now and meet some of the people who made it function. In the fields surrounding the city, farmers were already at work in the early morning coolness, tending the crops that fed everyone. Farming was the foundation of everything. Without the farmers coaxing barley and wheat from the irrigated soil, none of the rest of civilization could exist. Most people in Mesopotamia were farmers, just as most people everywhere in the ancient world worked the land. But cities allowed for something new, specialization. Not everyone had to farm. Some people could dedicate themselves entirely to a particular craft, becoming skilled artisans whose work was valued and sought after. The potter, for instance, was an essential craftsperson. Every household needed pottery, jars for storing grain and oil, bowls for eating, cups for drinking, cooking vessels. The invention of the potter's wheel, sometime in the 4th millennium BCE, revolutionized pottery production. Before the wheel, each pot had to be built up slowly by hand, coil by coil. With the wheel, a skilled potter could center a lump of clay on the spinning wheel and pull up the walls of a vessel in moments, creating symmetrical, beautiful forms with remarkable speed. This was one of humanity's first experiences with mass production. A single potter could now create dozens of vessels in a day, all similar in form, all of consistent quality. Pottery became more affordable, more available. Standards emerged. You could buy a pot knowing it would be roughly the same size and shape as the pot you bought last time. Weavers and textile workers transformed wool and flax into cloth. This was skilled, time-consuming work, primarily done by women. The wool had to be cleaned, carded to align the fibers, spun into thread on a hand spindle, and then woven on a loom. A single garment might represent weeks of labor. Fine textiles, with complex patterns and rich dyes, were luxury goods, valuable enough to be used as currency in trade. The Mesopotamians became famous for their textiles. Wool from their large sheep herds was processed into cloth that was traded far and wide. Dyeing was a specialized craft, certain colors were difficult to achieve and therefore precious. Purple, extracted from certain sea snails, was extremely expensive. Rich reds came from insects. Blues and yellows from various plants. A garment of fine wool, skillfully woven and richly dyed, was a treasure. Metalworkers were particularly valued craftspeople. They worked with copper, bronze, silver, and gold, creating tools, weapons, jewelry, and ritual objects. Metallurgy required specialized knowledge, how to achieve the right temperatures, how to alloy copper with tin to create harder bronze, how to cast complex forms, how to hammer and anneal and shape the metal. Metal was valuable, and metalworkers often worked directly for temples or palaces, creating objects for the gods or the elite. A skilled metalworker might craft a magnificent ceremonial weapon for a king, or a beautiful statue for a temple, or delicate gold jewelry for a wealthy woman. The Mesopotamians also developed the technology of fired brick. Unlike sun-dried mud brick, which was vulnerable to water and erosion, fired brick was baked in kilns at high temperatures, becoming nearly as durable as stone. Fired brick was expensive, the fuel required for firing was considerable, so it was used selectively, for important structures, for facing prestigious buildings, for areas that needed to resist water like well linings and drainage systems. All of these goods, pottery, textiles, metalwork, bricks, flowed through markets. Mesopotamian cities had bustling marketplaces where merchants and craftspeople sold their wares. Farmers brought produce from the fields. Fishermen offered their catch. Artisans displayed their handiwork. The markets were centers of economic activity, but also social centers, places where people gathered, where news and gossip were exchanged, where the life of the city pulsed most vibrantly. Merchants were a distinct class, people who specialized not in making goods but in moving them, trading them, connecting producers with buyers. Some merchants operated locally, within the city and its immediate region. Others engaged in long-distance trade, traveling far from home, sometimes for months or years at a time. The rivers were highways of trade. Mesopotamia's position between the Tigris and Euphrates made water transport practical and efficient. Boats could carry far more cargo than donkeys or human porters. The Mesopotamians developed sailboats, harnessing the wind to move goods upstream and down. These weren't the ocean-going vessels we might imagine. They were river craft, reed boats, or wooden boats with shallow drafts, designed for the particular conditions of Mesopotamian rivers. But they were effective, allowing bulk goods to move efficiently. Grain from the fields could be shipped to the cities. Clay and reeds could be transported to building sites. Trade goods could travel hundreds of miles. Long-distance trade connected Mesopotamia to distant lands. Timber came from the mountains to the north and east, from the famous cedar forests of Lebanon. Stone for construction and sculpture came from quarries in the highlands. Metals, copper, tin, silver, gold, were imported from various regions. Precious stones like lapis lazuli came from as far away as Afghanistan, traveling through multiple hands along ancient trade routes. In exchange, Mesopotamia exported its agricultural surplus, grain, dates, wool. It exported textiles, highly valued for their quality. It exported manufactured goods. And perhaps most importantly, it exported silver. Silver functioned as a standard of value in Mesopotamian economy. This wasn't quite the same as money as we know it. There were no silver coins, coinage wouldn't be invented for another couple of thousand years. Instead, silver was measured by weight. Prices might be expressed in shekels of silver, with a shekel being a specific weight, roughly 8 grams. Most everyday transactions didn't actually involve silver changing hands. The economy was primarily based on barter, direct exchange of goods and services. A farmer might trade barley for a pot. A fisherman might exchange fish for sandals. Accounts might be kept, debts recorded, with eventual settlement in goods or silver. But for large transactions, for long-distance trade, for storing wealth, silver was essential. A merchant traveling to distant lands would carry silver, which was recognized and valued everywhere. Silver was portable wealth, much more convenient than carrying sacks of grain or herds of sheep. Temples and palaces often held large stores of silver, functioning something like banks. They might make loans, charging interest. They might pay workers partly in silver, which the workers could then use to purchase what they needed. This was a complex, sophisticated economy. Record-keeping, those clay tablets we discussed, was essential to making it work. Contracts specified obligations. Receipts proved payment. Account books tracked debts and credits. The whole system depended on writing, on permanent records that couldn't be disputed or forgotten. But life in Mesopotamia wasn't all work and trade and economic activity. People also played, celebrated, enjoyed themselves. One of the most fascinating artifacts we have from ancient Mesopotamia is a board game called the Royal Game of Yore. Beautiful examples were found in the royal tombs at Yore, elaborately decorated game boards inlaid with shell and lapis lazuli. But simpler versions were common, scratched into courtyards or drawn in the dirt. The game was played on a distinctive board with 20 squares arranged in a specific pattern. Players had markers, typically 7 per player, and moved them based on the throw of dice. Yes, the Mesopotamians had dice, though theirs were 4-sided, shaped like elongated pyramids. The goal was to move all your markers around the board and off before your opponent did. People loved this game. It was played in palaces and humble homes. Versions of it spread throughout the ancient Near East. It was a way to pass time, to socialize, to gamble perhaps, to compete in a safe and entertaining way. Other games existed too. Children played with toys, dolls, miniature animals, balls. There were gambling games. There were contests of skill and chance. Play was part of life, a necessary counterbalance to work and obligation. Music filled the ancient Mesopotamian world. The lyre was perhaps the most important musical instrument, a stringed instrument held in the lap or against the chest, plucked with the fingers. Magnificent lyres were crafted for temples and palaces, their sound boxes decorated with elaborate inlays and sculptures. The sound of the lyre accompanied temple rituals, royal banquets, private celebrations. The harp was another stringed instrument, larger than the lyre, often standing on the floor. Its deeper, resonant tones added richness to musical ensembles. Drums provided rhythm, frame drums, held in one hand and struck with the other, or larger drums beaten with both hands or with sticks. There were wind instruments too, flutes and pipes made from reeds or bone. There were rattles and bells and clappers, adding percussive accents. Music was everywhere, in religious rituals, in celebrations, in entertainment, in work songs that helped rhythm and coordinate labor. Musicians were professionals, trained specialists. Some were attached to temples, performing in the daily rituals and great festivals. Some served in palaces, entertaining the royal court. Some made their living playing at weddings, banquets, and other celebrations. Being a skilled musician was a respectable profession, and the best musicians were valued and well compensated. Singers, too, were important. Hymns to the gods required proper singing, not just speaking. Epic poems and stories were often sung or chanted rather than simply recited. The rhythm and melody helped memory and added emotional power to the words. Professional storytellers and singers would travel from city to city, performing in marketplaces and at gatherings. They knew the great stories, tales of heroes like Gilgamesh, myths of the gods, historical legends. They might perform for payment, receiving food, beer, or small gifts from appreciative audiences. A skilled storyteller could hold a crowd entranced for hours, bringing the ancient tales to life with voice and gesture. People also enjoyed athletic competitions and physical activities. Wrestling was popular, with skilled wrestlers competing in matches that drew crowds of spectators. These weren't the choreographed performances we see in modern professional wrestling, but genuine athletic contests, tests of strength and skill. Hunting, for the wealthy and powerful, was both practical and sporting. Kings boasted of their hunting prowess, killing lions and wild bulls. These hunts were dangerous, requiring courage and skill, and success in hunting demonstrated the qualities needed for leadership, bravery, strength, decisiveness. For common people, hunting was more practical, a way to supplement the diet with game birds, gazelles, wild pigs. But it could still be enjoyable, a break from routine labor, time spent in the countryside with companions. And then there were the festivals. Throughout the year, the religious calendar was punctuated with festivals honoring various gods. These were times when normal work ceased, when the whole city participated in celebrations. There would be processions through the streets, statues of gods carried on platforms, priests and priestesses in elaborate costumes. There would be music and singing, special foods and abundant beer, sometimes lasting for days. The New Year festival was particularly important, marking the beginning of a new agricultural cycle, a time of renewal. The Enuma Elish creation epic we discussed earlier was recited during the New Year festival in Babylon, reminding everyone of the cosmic order and the gods' power. Festivals were times of community, when social distinctions might temporarily blur, when everyone participated in the same celebration, when joy and abundance were shared. They were reminders that life wasn't only about survival and duty, but also about celebration and connection. Picture the city during a festival. Streets crowded with people in their finest clothes. Music echoing from every direction. The smell of special foods cooking. Children darting through the crowds, excited and wide-eyed. Beer flowing freely. Laughter and singing. The great procession passing by, the statue of the god magnificent on its platform, priests chanting hymns. Everyone feeling part of something larger than themselves, connected to their community, to their gods, to the eternal rhythms of the cosmos. And when the festival ended and normal life resumed, people would return to their work refreshed, renewed, carrying the memory of joy and celebration with them. Work and play, trade and festival, craft and music, all of these wove together to create the fabric of Mesopotamian life. It was a world of human ingenuity and effort, of creativity and skill, of community and connection. Rest now with these images of ancient life. The potter's wheel spinning. The lyre's strings resonating. The merchant's boat sailing down the river. The wrestler's match drawing cheers. The festival procession winding through streets. All of this happened thousands of years ago in the cities between the rivers. All of these people lived and worked and played and loved and created. Let their world fade gently into peaceful dreams. Every society creates structure, establishes order, determines who has power and who must obey. In ancient Mesopotamia, This social hierarchy was visible, explicit, considered natural and divinely ordained. Let's explore now how Mesopotamian society was organized, from the heights of royal power to the depths of slavery. At the very top of the social pyramid stood the king. The Mesopotamians had various words for king: Lugal in Sumerian, meaning big man, or Sharu in Akkadian. But whatever the title, the king's position was unique and exalted. Kings weren't merely political leaders. They were intermediaries between the human and divine worlds. The gods, the Mesopotamians believed, had chosen the king to rule on their behalf. Kingship itself was a gift from heaven, literally descended from the sky in the beginning of time. A king ruled by divine mandate, and his authority therefore carried sacred weight. This didn't mean kings were considered gods themselves, at least not usually. There were a few kings who claimed divinity during their lifetimes, but this was exceptional and often controversial. More typically, the king was understood as the gods' chosen representative, their agent on earth, responsible for maintaining order and justice, for building and maintaining temples, for leading the army in defense of the gods' cities. The relationship between kings and gods was reciprocal. The king served the gods through ritual action, through building programs, through maintaining proper worship. In return, the gods granted the king victory in battle, long life, prosperity for the land. If the gods withdrew their favor, disaster would follow: military defeat, bad harvests, disease. A king's success proved divine approval. His failures suggested the gods were displeased. Just below the king in the social hierarchy were the priests and priestesses. These were the people who managed the temples, who performed the daily rituals that sustained the gods and maintained cosmic order. Priests weren't merely religious specialists. They were also administrators, managing vast temple estates and the economic activity that centered on the temples. Temples owned extensive lands, worked by temple dependents. They engaged in trade, ran workshops where textiles and other goods were manufactured. They stored grain and other commodities, functioning something like banks. They employed large staffs, priests and priestesses certainly, but also scribes, craftspeople, laborious, guards. Temple economies were major parts of the overall economic system. High-ranking priests came from elite families and wielded considerable influence. They advised kings, controlled significant wealth, commanded respect from all levels of society. Priestesses, too, could hold important positions, especially in the cults of goddesses like Inanna. Some priestesses were royal daughters, sent to temples to strengthen the connection between the royal house and the divine. Below the priests came the nobles and high officials, people who served in the royal administration, who governed cities and provinces on the king's behalf, who commanded military units, who managed royal estates. These were wealthy, powerful individuals, often from families that had held high status for generations. Scribes occupied an interesting position. They weren't usually as wealthy or powerful as nobles, but their specialized knowledge gave them influence and security. As we've discussed, literacy was rare and valuable. Scribes were needed everywhere, and a capable scribe could expect steady employment and respect. The profession could provide a path to moderate prosperity and status, especially for families who weren't born into the highest ranks. Merchants also formed a distinct group. The most successful merchants could become quite wealthy through long-distance trade, though their status was somewhat ambiguous. They had money but not necessarily the hereditary prestige of nobles. Still, wealth brought its own form of power, and rich merchants could arrange marriages with noble families, gradually elevating their social position. Below these groups came the vast majority of the population, ordinary farmers, craftspeople, and laborers. These were free people, not slaves, but their lives were constrained by obligation and limited opportunity. Farmers worked land that might be owned by temples, the palace, or private landlords, paying rent or taxes from their harvests. Craftspeople practiced their trades, selling their work or laboring for wages. Common laborers did the heavy, unskilled work, digging canals, building walls, hauling goods. Life for common people was difficult. Work was physically demanding. The margin between sufficiency and hunger was thin. A bad harvest, an illness, an accident could push a family into crisis. There were no safety nets, no social services. Your family, your neighborhood, your community were your only supports. And at the very bottom of the social hierarchy were slaves. Slavery existed in Mesopotamia, as it did throughout the ancient world. But Mesopotamian slavery had particular characteristics that distinguish it from, say, the plantation slavery of more recent centuries. Slaves in Mesopotamia came from two main sources. Many were war captives. When Mesopotamian armies conquered an enemy city, prisoners might be enslaved and distributed among the victors or sold in slave markets. These foreign slaves had no community ties, no family protection, no legal standing. They were considered property, though even they had some limited rights. They could not be killed arbitrarily, for instance. But many slaves were actually debt slaves, free Mesopotamians who had fallen into such desperate poverty that they sold themselves or family members into slavery to pay off debts. A farmer facing starvation might sell a child to a wealthy household, knowing the child would at least be fed. Or a person deeply in debt might enter into debt slavery themselves, working off what they owed. Debt slavery was supposed to be temporary. Legal codes often specified that debt slaves must be freed after a certain number of years, typically 3 to 7. But in practice, escape from slavery could be difficult. If you were freed but had no resources, no land, no tools, how would you survive? Some freed slaves might end up back in slavery, the cycle repeating. Slaves worked in households, in fields, in workshops. A wealthy household might have several slaves handling domestic work, cooking, cleaning, childcare, maintenance. Temples and palaces owned many slaves, employing them in agricultural work or manufacturing. Some slaves had specialized skills and might be treated relatively well, even entrusted with responsibilities. Others did the hardest, most unpleasant labor. This social hierarchy was relatively rigid. Social mobility existed, but it was limited. A particularly talented scribe might rise to an important administrative position. A successful merchant might marry into a noble family. A soldier who distinguished himself in battle might be rewarded with land and status. But these were exceptions. Most people remained in roughly the social position they were born into. The system was accepted as natural, ordained by the gods. The Mesopotamians didn't question whether social hierarchy should exist. Of course it should, how else could society function? The question was whether the hierarchy was being maintained properly, whether those in power were fulfilling their obligations, whether justice was being administered fairly. And that brings us to law. Because one of the king's primary responsibilities was to ensure justice, to maintain order, to protect the weak from the powerful. The most famous Mesopotamian law code is the Code of Hammurabi, though it wasn't actually the first such code. Earlier kings had promulgated law codes, but Hammurabi's is the most complete one that has survived. Hammurabi was a king of Babylon who ruled in the 18th century BCE, and he had his law code inscribed on a large stone stela, topped with a relief showing Hammurabi receiving the laws from Shamash, the sun god and god of justice. The stela still exists, displayed now in the Louvre Museum in Paris, though most people in Hammurabi's time would have known the laws from clay tablet copies distributed throughout the kingdom. The code contains nearly 300 laws, covering an enormous range of situations: property disputes, trade regulations, marriage and divorce, inheritance, personal injury, theft, agricultural issues, and more. The Code of Hammurabi is famous for the principle often summarized as an eye for an eye, a tooth for a tooth. If you caused someone to lose an eye, you would lose your eye in return. This sounds harsh to us, but it was actually a form of proportionate justice. The punishment shouldn't exceed the crime. You can't kill someone for causing a minor injury. The punishment must fit the offense. But here's something crucial: this eye for an eye justice applied primarily between social equals. If a nobleman destroyed another nobleman's eye, he would lose his own eye. But if a nobleman destroyed a commoner's eye, he only had to pay a fine. And if a nobleman destroyed a slave's eye, he paid the slave's owner half the slave's value as compensation. Justice, in Hammurabi's code, was explicitly unequal, stratified by social class. The same crime carried different punishments depending on who committed it and who the victim was. A commoner who struck a nobleman might have his hand cut off. A nobleman who struck a commoner would merely pay a fine. This might seem terribly unjust by modern standards, but the Mesopotamians saw it differently. Social distinctions were real and important. Different people had different obligations and different privileges based on their position in society. The law reflected and enforced these distinctions. Still, the code did offer protections even to those of lower status. Slaves had some rights. Women had some protections. The weak weren't completely without recourse. The code's existence itself was significant. It established that law should be public, known, consistent. You couldn't be punished arbitrarily. The rules were written down for all to see. Legal disputes were handled in courts. Judges might be royal appointees, or temple officials, or assemblies of city elders. In a typical case, both parties would present their arguments and evidence. Witnesses might testify. Written contracts and receipts would be examined if relevant. Oaths were taken very seriously. A person might swear by the gods that they were telling the truth, and such an oath was considered binding. To lie under oath was to offend the gods themselves, inviting divine punishment. Sometimes a case might be decided by having someone swear an oath. If they were willing to swear by the gods, they might be believed. If they refused to swear, that itself was telling. Some cases were decided by ordeal. If the evidence was unclear or contested, the accused might be thrown into the river. If they survived, the gods had vindicated them. If they drowned, they were guilty. This seems bizarre to us, but it made sense within their worldview. The gods were just, and they would protect the innocent and punish the guilty. The ordeal was a way of asking for divine judgment when human judgment was uncertain. Many of the laws dealt with marriage and family matters, areas where social order and justice intersected most personally. Adultery laws, for instance, were harsh, especially for women. If a married woman was caught in adultery, both she and her lover could be bound together and thrown into the river to drown. However, her husband had the right to pardon her, and if he did, the king might pardon the lover as well. A man's adultery was treated differently. A married man could have sex with slaves or prostitutes without consequence. It was only considered adultery if he had sex with another man's wife, and in that case, it was understood as a crime against the wronged husband, a violation of his property rights, more than a moral failing. These gender double standards pervaded the law codes. A woman's sexuality was controlled, her chastity before marriage and fidelity after marriage essential to ensuring legitimate heirs. A man's sexuality was much less restricted. But women weren't entirely powerless. As we discussed earlier, women could own property, engage in business, initiate divorce under certain circumstances. The law codes protected widows from being cheated of their inheritance. They ensured divorced women received their dowries back. They specified support for abandoned wives. Within a patriarchal system, there were still rules meant to protect women from complete exploitation. The legal system wasn't perfect. Justice wasn't equal. The powerful had advantages the weak could never match. But there was law, publicly proclaimed, theoretically applicable to all. There were courts where disputes could be heard. There were judges who might enforce the rules even against the powerful, at least sometimes. And there was the ideal, expressed repeatedly in royal inscriptions, that the king was responsible for justice, for protecting widows and orphans, for ensuring the strong didn't oppress the weak. Whether kings lived up to this ideal is debatable. But the ideal existed, and it mattered. It gave people a standard by which to judge their rulers. It created expectations that might, occasionally, be enforced. Picture now the great stone stela with Hammurabi's laws, standing in the city square. People gathering around it, reading or having it read to them. Seeing that the law applied to everyone, even to nobles, even to the king's own officials. Knowing that if they were wronged, there was a court they could appeal to, a law they could invoke. It wasn't perfect justice. But it was law, consistent and public. It was order, in a world that always threatened to descend into chaos. Rest now with this knowledge of ancient law and ancient order. The scales of justice, carefully balanced. The judge hearing cases. The law written in stone, enduring through millennia. Justice was sought, even if not always found. Order was maintained, even if imperfectly. And life continued, structured by rules and obligations, in the cities between the rivers. Let these thoughts settle gently into sleep. The ancient world had its own wisdom, its own understanding of justice and order. Different from ours, but not without meaning. Sleep peacefully, as the ancients slept, under the same stars, in the same pursuit of justice and order. When illness struck in ancient Mesopotamia, when a child developed a fever or a farmer injured his leg or a woman suffered through a difficult childbirth, where did people turn for help? The answer reveals much about how the Mesopotamians understood the world and their place in it. Healing in Mesopotamia was the domain of two types of practitioners, often working together. There was the Asu, who we might call a physician, someone who treated illness with practical remedies, herbs, bandages, sometimes surgery. And there was the Ashipu, a priest healer who dealt with the spiritual dimensions of disease, using incantations, rituals, and prayers to drive away the demons or divine anger that caused illness. Because the Mesopotamians believed that disease had both physical and spiritual causes. Yes, a wound might become infected because it was dirty. But why did it become infected? Perhaps a demon had entered through the wound. Perhaps the person had offended a god. Perhaps someone had cursed them. Effective treatment needed to address both the physical symptoms and the spiritual causes. The Asu healers had considerable practical knowledge. They understood that certain herbs could reduce fever, ease pain, or help wounds heal. They made poultices and salves, mixed medicinal drinks, set broken bones, stitched deep wounds. Their knowledge had been accumulated over centuries, recorded on clay tablets, passed from master to apprentice. Some of the plant-based medicines they used were genuinely effective. Willow bark, which contains a compound similar to aspirin, could reduce pain and fever. Poppy extract could ease severe pain. Various herbs had real medicinal properties: antiseptic, anti-inflammatory, digestive. The healers didn't understand the biochemistry, but they knew from experience that these remedies often worked. They also performed surgery when necessary. Archaeological evidence shows that Mesopotamian surgeons could perform trepanation, drilling holes in the skull, perhaps to relieve pressure or treat head injuries. They amputated damaged limbs. They lanced abscesses and removed bladder stones. These procedures were dangerous, performed without anesthesia beyond perhaps some opium or alcohol, without antibiotics, without modern understanding of infection. Many patients died. But some survived, and the healers learned from each case. There's even evidence of prosthetics. A woman's skeleton was found with an artificial toe, carved from wood and leather, designed to help her walk. This speaks to both medical knowledge and compassion. Someone cared enough about this woman's mobility to craft a functional prosthetic for her. But physical remedies alone weren't enough. The Ashipu priest healers would diagnose the spiritual cause of the illness. They might determine that the patient had unknowingly violated a taboo, or that they were cursed, or that a particular demon was afflicting them. Then they would perform the appropriate rituals, speaking incantations, making offerings, sometimes creating protective amulets for the patient to wear. These incantations were taken very seriously. They were written down, preserved, taught carefully. They had to be recited correctly, with the proper accompanying rituals, or they wouldn't work. The Ashipu was a learned professional, trained for years, someone who understood the complex relationships between humans, gods, and demons. Modern people might dismiss this as superstition, but consider, the incantations and rituals provided psychological comfort. They assured the sick person that something was being done, that powerful forces were being marshaled on their behalf. In an age without effective medicine for most diseases, hope and comfort mattered. The placebo effect is real, and the Ashipu's confident rituals likely helped many patients feel better, which might have aided actual recovery. Despite the healers' efforts, life expectancy in ancient Mesopotamia was short by modern standards. Many children died in infancy or early childhood from infectious diseases, malnutrition, accidents. Those who survived childhood might live to their 40s or 50s if they were fortunate. Some people certainly lived longer, into their 60s or even 70s, but they were exceptions. Death in childbirth was a constant danger for women. Disease swept through cities periodically. We have records of plagues, though we can't always identify exactly what diseases they were. Injuries that today would be minor could become fatal if infected. Dental problems were common and could be agonizing, with no real treatment available. Sanitation was limited. Cities had drainage systems for wastewater, and some houses had primitive toilets that drained into cesspits, but by modern standards, sanitation was poor. Garbage accumulated in streets. Human and animal waste contaminated water sources. Flies and rodents spread disease. The Mesopotamians understood cleanliness was important. They bathed regularly, washed before meals and religious rituals, but they didn't understand disease transmission. So life was precarious, health fragile, death ever present. People lived with this reality, accepting it as the human condition. They turned to their healers when sick, made offerings to the gods for protection, wore amulets against demons, and hoped for the best. And yet, despite these hardships, civilization continued. Cities grew. Cultures flourished. And eventually, some cities grew beyond their walls, reaching out to conquer others, building something new and ambitious, empires. For most of early Mesopotamian history, the political landscape was fragmented. Each city was essentially independent, ruled by its own king, with its own patron god. Cities might form alliances, but these were temporary. Cities warred with each other over land, water rights, trade routes. Power shifted constantly. No single city dominated for long. Then, around 2334 BCE, everything changed. A man named Sargon, the name might mean true king or legitimate king, seized power in the city of Akkad. Sargon wasn't from a noble family. Legend says he was found as a baby floating in a basket in the river, raised by a gardener. Whether this story is true or legendary, Sargon rose from obscurity to create something unprecedented, the world's first empire. Sargon didn't just conquer a few neighboring cities. He conquered all of Sumer, the region of city-states in southern Mesopotamia. Then he conquered north into Akkad. He pushed west into Syria. His armies may have reached the Mediterranean Sea and the mountains of Anatolia. For the first time, a vast territory was united under a single ruler. This was the Akkadian Empire, and it established a template that would be repeated again and again through Mesopotamian history. Centralized administration, a professional army, standardized weights and measures, royal appointees governing conquered territories, all of this enforced by military might. Sargon and his successors promoted the Akkadian language, a Semitic language different from Sumerian. Akkadian would eventually become the lingua franca of the ancient Near East, used in diplomacy and trade from Egypt to Persia. But the Akkadian kings also respected Sumerian culture, maintaining its temples, supporting its literature, presenting themselves as legitimate heirs to Sumerian tradition. The Akkadian Empire lasted for about a century and a half before collapsing around 2154 BCE, possibly due to some combination of internal rebellion, external invasion, and climate change. There's evidence of a severe drought that may have destabilized the entire region. After the Akkadian collapse, Mesopotamia fragmented again into competing kingdoms. But the imperial idea remained. Kings dreamed of reuniting the land, of achieving the glory Sargon had achieved. Eventually, a new city rose to prominence, Babylon. Located in central Mesopotamia on the Euphrates River, Babylon would become perhaps the most famous Mesopotamian city, its very name synonymous with ancient grandeur and mystery. Babylon's greatest king was Hammurabi, who ruled from about 1792 to 1750 BCE. Yes, the same Hammurabi whose law code we discussed earlier. Hammurabi started as king of a relatively minor city-state, but through military conquest and shrewd diplomacy, he gradually expanded his power until he controlled all of southern Mesopotamia and much of the north. Hammurabi wasn't just a conqueror. He was an administrator, organizing his empire efficiently, establishing that famous law code to unify legal practice across his territories. He promoted Marduk, Babylon's patron god, as the supreme deity, using religion to legitimize and unify his empire. The Enuma Elish creation epic, which features Marduk becoming king of the gods, probably reached its final form during this period. Under Hammurabi, Babylon became a magnificent city, with great temples, impressive walls, and a sophisticated canal system. For a time, it was the center of the Mesopotamian world. But empires rise and fall, After Hammurabi's death, Babylon's power gradually declined. New powers emerged, and one would prove particularly formidable: Assyria. The Assyrians came from northern Mesopotamia, centered on the city of Ashur on the Tigris River. For centuries, Assyria had been overshadowed by southern powers. But starting around 900 BCE, Assyria began a military expansion that would eventually create the largest empire the ancient Near East had yet seen. The Assyrians were feared as ruthless warriors. Their army was magnificent, professional, disciplined, equipped with the best weapons technology could provide. And they had a crucial advantage: iron weapons. Iron had been known for centuries, but it was rare and difficult to work. Bronze remained the primary metal for weapons and tools. But around 1200 BCE, ironworking technology advanced significantly. Iron ore was much more common than the copper and tin needed for bronze, and iron, when properly forged, could be harder and hold a sharper edge than bronze. The Assyrians mastered ironworking and armed their soldiers with iron weapons: swords, spears, arrowheads. Their iron weapons could shatter enemy bronze weapons. This gave them a decisive military advantage. The Assyrians also developed sophisticated siege technology. Earlier warfare often meant simply surrounding a walled city and waiting for it to surrender from starvation. The Assyrians built massive siege engines, wheeled towers that could be pushed up to city walls, protected by hides or metal plating. From these towers, archers could shoot down at defenders while soldiers worked to break through gates or undermine walls. They had battering rams, massive beams capped with bronze or iron, suspended from wheeling frames, pounded repeatedly against walls and gates until they collapsed. No city could feel safe behind its walls when the Assyrian army appeared. Cities that surrendered quickly might be treated leniently. Those that resisted were destroyed, their populations massacred or deported. The Assyrians used terror deliberately, as a tool of empire. If everyone knew that resistance meant total destruction, fewer cities would resist. The Assyrian Empire at its height, in the 7th century BCE, stretched from Egypt to Persia, from Anatolia to the Persian Gulf. It was vast, powerful, wealthy. Tribute flowed in from conquered peoples. Massive building projects, palaces, temples, new cities, proclaimed Assyrian might. The city of Ashur remained religiously important, but the Assyrian kings built other magnificent capitals: Nimrud, Khorsabad, and especially Nineveh. Nineveh became one of the ancient world's greatest cities, with massive walls, beautiful palaces decorated with elaborate stone reliefs showing royal hunts and military victories, and a famous library where thousands of clay tablets preserved Mesopotamian literature and learning. Religion helped hold the empire together. The god Ashur, patron deity of the city of Ashur, was promoted as the supreme god, the divine king who commanded the Assyrian king to conquer and rule. Military campaigns were presented as religious missions, spreading the worship of Ashur and bringing rebellious lands under divine order. The king was Ashur's representative on earth, and to rebel against the king was to rebel against God himself. This imperial religion served political purposes, providing ideological justification for conquest and domination. But it was also genuinely believed. The Assyrian kings and their subjects truly thought they were serving divine purposes, bringing order to chaos, civilization to barbarism. Yet empires built on military might and terror are inherently unstable. The Assyrians made many enemies. Conquered peoples hated them and waited for opportunities to rebel. Maintaining the empire required constant military campaigns, enormous resources, brutal repression. In 612 BCE, a coalition of enemies, Babylonians and Medes primarily, attacked the Assyrian heartland. They besieged and destroyed Nineveh, that magnificent city. The Assyrian Empire collapsed with shocking speed, and Assyria never recovered its power. The empire that had seemed invincible simply ended. But the imperial idea remained. New empires would rise, the Babylonians again, then the Persians, then Alexander's Greeks, then the Romans. The pattern Sargon established so long ago, centralized power, professional armies, conquered territories, imperial religion, would repeat throughout history. Let these images rest in your mind now. Sargon the Conqueror, rising from obscurity to reshape the world. Hammurabi the Lawgiver, administering justice from his Babylonian throne. The Assyrian army, iron weapons gleaming, siege engines rolling toward doomed cities. Empire rising and falling, like waves on the shore. Power is temporary. Cities fall. Empires crumble to dust. But the patterns persist, echoing through time. Rest now. Let go of conquest and conflict. Empires have risen and fallen. Kings have lived and died. Their clay tablets remain, telling their stories to anyone who will listen. Sleep peacefully, as the ancient cities sleep beneath the earth, their glories and their terrors long past. In the ancient land between two rivers, the people of Mesopotamia expressed their devotion and their power through structures that reached toward the heavens. These were not merely buildings, but statements carved in brick and stone, testaments to human ambition and divine connection that would stand for thousands of years. The ziggurat of Ur rises from the desert sands, a stepped pyramid of sun-baked brick that once dominated the skyline of one of humanity's earliest cities. Imagine standing at its base, looking upward at the massive terraces climbing toward the sky, each level smaller than the one below, creating a mountain made by human hands. The ziggurat was not just a temple, but a bridge between earth and heaven, a place where the gods might descend to meet their people. The ancient Sumerians believed their patron deity lived at the very top, in a small shrine where only priests could venture. The structure itself was a statement of faith, built over generations, with each brick laid as an offering, each layer added with prayer and ceremony. The walls surrounding these ancient cities were themselves monuments to human ingenuity and the desire for safety. Massive fortifications of mud brick, sometimes dozens of feet thick, encircled the great urban centers of Mesopotamia. These walls were more than mere defenses. They defined the boundary between civilization and wilderness, between order and chaos. The city gates that punctuated these walls were elaborate affairs, often decorated with glazed bricks depicting sacred animals and divine guardians. To pass through one of these gates was to enter a different world, a place where laws governed behavior and gods watched over daily life. The gates had names, often invoking protection or celebrating victories, and they served as gathering places where merchants traded, officials collected taxes, and travelers shared news from distant lands. In Babylon, the most famous of these processional ways stretched from the outer city through the Ishtar Gate and into the heart of the sacred precinct. This was no ordinary street, but a ceremonial pathway lined with walls adorned with brilliant blue glazed bricks. Upon these walls strode lions in yellow and white, creatures sacred to the goddess Ishtar, their forms repeated again and again in endless procession. Walking this path during a festival, surrounded by crowds of worshippers, one would have been overwhelmed by color and symbolism. The blue of the walls, achieved through precious lapis lazuli glaze, represented the heavens. The lions represented divine power and royal authority. Every element was chosen with care, every image placed with purpose. This was architecture as prayer, as propaganda, as art, all combined into one overwhelming experience. The art of Mesopotamia spoke in symbols that its people could read as easily as we read words today. Relief sculptures carved into palace walls and temple doors told stories of kings and gods, of battles won and tribute received. These weren't just decorations, but historical records and religious texts made visible. A common motif shows a king receiving divine authority from a seated deity, establishing the ruler's right to govern as coming directly from the gods themselves. Winged bulls with human heads, called lamasu, guarded important doorways, their multiple legs suggesting they could be seen from multiple angles, always vigilant, always protective. Cylinder seals, small carved stones that could be rolled across wet clay, created intricate images of mythology and daily life. Each symbol carried layers of meaning understood by those who lived among them. The rhythm of life in Mesopotamia was marked by festivals that connected the people to their gods, to the seasons, and to each other. The greatest of these was Akkad, the New Year festival, celebrated in the spring when the world itself seemed to be reborn. This wasn't a single day of celebration, but an 11-day ritual that involved the entire city. The king would temporarily surrender his authority, humbling himself before the gods. Statues of deities would be paraded through the streets, taken from their temples to visit each other in an elaborate social calendar for the divine. The people would gather to witness these processions, to participate in prayers and offerings, to feast and celebrate the renewal of cosmic order. During Akkad, the creation story would be recited, reminding everyone how the gods had brought order from chaos, and through ritual, that order would be maintained for another year. Within these festivals, particularly during Akkad, sacred marriage rituals were performed. These ceremonies symbolically united the king with the goddess Inanna, or later Ishtar, representing the union of heaven and earth, divine and mortal, fertility and kingship. The details of these rituals remain somewhat mysterious, but they were considered essential to ensuring the prosperity of the land. Through this symbolic marriage, the king became more than just a ruler, he became a mediator between human and divine realms. The goddess would bestow fertility upon the land, abundant harvests, healthy livestock, thriving children. This wasn't mere theater, but a fundamental act of cosmic maintenance, a ritual believed necessary for the continuation of life itself. Yet the grand temples and public festivals were only part of Mesopotamian religious life. In homes throughout the cities and villages, families maintained their own relationships with the divine through household gods. These were small figurines, often crudely made compared to the grand statuary of temples, but deeply personal and profoundly important. Each home had its shrine, perhaps just a niche in a wall where these figures stood watch over the family. Offerings were made regularly, small amounts of food, drops of beer or wine, incense on special occasions. These household deities were protectors and intermediaries, guardians who watched over a family's daily struggles and joys. They received prayers for health, for successful business dealings, for safety in childbirth, for protection from evil spirits. The relationship between a family and their household gods was intimate and ongoing, passed down through generations. When death came, as it inevitably did, the Mesopotamians approached it with specific customs designed to ease the transition from life to whatever lay beyond. Burial customs varied across the long span of Mesopotamian history and its many cultures, but certain elements remained constant. The dead were often buried beneath the floors of houses, keeping them close to the living family, or in cemeteries outside city walls. Bodies might be placed in ceramic coffins, wrapped in reed mats, or laid to rest in simple graves. Grave goods accompanied the deceased, items they might need in the afterlife: food, drink, personal possessions, tools of their trade. The wealthy were buried with jewelry, weapons, fine pottery. The poor made do with simpler offerings, but offerings nonetheless, for it was believed that the dead needed sustenance in the world below. Mourning was a public and demonstrative affair in ancient Mesopotamia. The death of a family member, particularly the head of a household, would trigger prescribed behaviors that showed grief and honored the deceased. Professional mourners might be hired to wail and tear their garments, amplifying the family's sorrow. Hair might be cut or left unbound, regular activities suspended, special foods eaten or avoided. These weren't empty gestures but necessary actions that helped the living process their loss and ensured the dead received proper honor. The Mesopotamians believed that neglected dead could become restless spirits, wandering and potentially malevolent. Proper mourning, proper burial, proper ongoing offerings, all these served to maintain the boundary between the living and the dead, to keep each in their proper realm while maintaining the bonds of family across that ultimate threshold. The afterlife itself, as the Mesopotamians conceived it, was a shadowy place called Akkad or Ker, a land of dust and darkness beneath the earth. It was not a place of reward or punishment in the way later religions would conceive the afterlife, but rather a dim continuation of existence where all the dead gathered regardless of their deeds in life. The spirits there were said to eat dust and clay, living a diminished version of earthly life. This rather bleak vision made the world of the living all the more precious, and perhaps explains why Mesopotamian culture was so focused on achievements and monuments that would last beyond a single lifetime. Unable to look forward to a glorious afterlife, they instead built ziggurats that touched the sky, carved their names in stone, and participated in festivals that connected them to something eternal. And so we see how the Mesopotamians understood their place in the cosmos through the monuments they built and the rituals they performed. From the ziggurat reaching upward to the graves reaching down, from the grand processional ways to the small household shrines, from the public spectacle of Akkad to the private grief of mourning, every element worked together to create meaning, to establish order, to connect the human and the divine. These ancient peoples, living thousands of years ago, sought the same things we seek today: safety, prosperity, connection, and some sense that our brief lives have meaning in the vast span of time. In the royal palace at Nineveh, in rooms specially designed for the purpose, one of history's greatest treasures was carefully assembled and preserved. This was the library of Ashurbanipal, a king who ruled Assyria in the 7th century before the Common Era, and who understood something profound about power and memory. Kings before him had conquered cities and accumulated gold, but Ashurbanipal sought to conquer knowledge itself, to gather all the wisdom of Mesopotamia into one place where it could be preserved for eternity. Imagine the scribes working in that library, carefully copying texts onto clay tablets, their styluses moving with practiced precision through the soft surface. Ashurbanipal sent agents throughout his empire with a specific mission: to find texts, to copy them, to bring that knowledge back to Nineveh. He wanted everything. Medical treatises that described treatments for countless ailments. Astronomical observations recorded over centuries. Mathematical problems and their solutions. Omens interpreted by generations of diviners. Literary works, including the great epic of Gilgamesh, that tale of friendship, mortality, and the search for meaning. Dictionaries and sign lists that helped scribes learn the complicated cuneiform writing system. Hymns and prayers to gods whose worship stretched back thousands of years. All of this, captured in wedge-shaped marks pressed into clay, organized and catalogued with care. The library was more than a collection. It was an act of preservation, a defense against the greatest enemy of all, forgetting. Ashurbanipal understood that empires rise and fall, that cities burn and populations scatter, but knowledge, if properly preserved, could survive such catastrophes. Each tablet was marked with a colophon, a note indicating where it came from, who copied it, and that it belonged to the royal collection. Some tablets even carried warnings against theft or damage, invoking curses upon anyone who would harm these precious records. The king was not just collecting, he was protecting, ensuring that the accumulated wisdom of generations would not vanish when his own empire eventually crumbled. And what wisdom was preserved there in those clay tablets? The myths that explained how the world began, how humans were created, why there is suffering and death. The story of the Great Flood, remarkably similar to later tales found in other cultures, describing how the gods decided to destroy humanity, but one righteous man was warned, built a boat, saved his family and the animals, and afterwards received divine blessing. Legal texts that showed how disputes were settled, how justice was conceived, what punishments fit what crimes. Scientific observations, the movement of planets and stars tracked across decades and centuries, the changing of seasons, the flooding of rivers. Medical knowledge, what plants could heal, what rituals might cure, what symptoms indicated which illnesses. All of human experience, it seemed, was there in that library, waiting to be read, to be learned from, to be remembered. The preservation of these texts was not accidental but intentional, a choice made by a king who valued knowledge as much as military might. And how fortunate we are that this choice was made, for when Nineveh fell, when the palace burned and the empire collapsed, those clay tablets survived. Fire, which destroys so much, actually helped preserve these tablets by baking them hard. They lay buried in the ruins for over 2,000 years until archaeologists uncovered them in the 19th century, bringing the voices of ancient Mesopotamia back into the world. Through Ashurbanipal's library, we can read the thoughts of people who lived millennia ago, understand their hopes and fears, learn from their accumulated wisdom. Memory, it turns out, can be stronger than empires. Yet even as Ashurbanipal was building his library, the world of Mesopotamia was changing. The great Assyrian Empire, which had dominated the region for centuries, was nearing its end. Within a few decades of Ashurbanipal's death, Nineveh would fall to a coalition of enemies. But from the ashes of Assyrian power, another empire would rise, one last flourishing of Mesopotamian civilization before the old ways gave way to new conquerors. This was the Neo-Babylonian Empire, a brief but brilliant revival of Babylonian glory. Babylon itself, that ancient city with its name meaning Gate of the Gods, became once more the center of civilization. Under a new dynasty of kings, the city was rebuilt and beautified on a scale never before seen. The old temples were restored, new palaces constructed, the walls strengthened and expanded. This was more than renovation, it was a conscious effort to connect with Babylon's glorious past, to reclaim the heritage of Hammurabi and the great kings of old. The Neo-Babylonian rulers saw themselves as inheritors and preservers of tradition, restoring what had been lost during centuries of Assyrian domination. The greatest of these Neo-Babylonian kings was Nebuchadnezzar II, whose very name has echoed through history. He ruled for over 40 years in the late 7th and early 6th centuries before the Common Era, and in that time he transformed Babylon into perhaps the most magnificent city the world had yet seen. The famous Hanging Gardens, described by later Greek writers as one of the wonders of the ancient world, were said to have been built by Nebuchadnezzar, though whether they truly existed remains a mystery lost to time. What we know for certain is that he rebuilt the temples, including the great ziggurat called Etemenanke, the foundation of heaven and earth, which may have inspired the biblical story of the Tower of Babel. He constructed the Ishtar Gate with its brilliant blue glazed bricks and golden animals. He fortified the city with massive walls, so thick that chariots could race along their tops. Nebuchadnezzar was not just a builder but a conqueror. His armies campaigned throughout the Levant, and most famously, he besieged and captured Jerusalem, bringing many of its people back to Babylon as captives. This Babylonian exile would become a defining moment in Jewish history, remembered in Psalms and prophecies, in lamentations and prayers. Yet Babylon itself, in these accounts, appears as a place of wonder as well as captivity, a great city that impressed even those who had reason to hate it. The exiles lived there, worked there, and some even prospered there, and when eventually they were allowed to return home, some chose to stay in the city by the river. But empires, no matter how magnificent, do not last forever. After Nebuchadnezzar's death, the Neo-Babylonian Empire began its decline. Weaker kings followed, internal disputes divided the kingdom, and new powers rose in the east. Persia, under Cyrus the Great, began its expansion, conquering the Medes, subduing Anatolia, and turning its attention to wealthy Babylon. The last king of Babylon, Nabonidus, was an unusual figure, more interested in religious reform and archaeology than in military preparedness. When Cyrus marched on Babylon, there was barely any resistance. In 539 before the Common Era, Babylon fell to the Persians. The ancient sources disagree on the details. Some say the city was taken without a battle, that the gates were opened from within. Others speak of treachery and divine judgment. What seems clear is that the transition was relatively peaceful. Cyrus presented himself not as a conqueror but as a liberator, restoring proper religious observances, freeing captive peoples, including the Jews, allowing them to return to their homelands. He took Mesopotamian titles and performed Mesopotamian rituals, honoring the gods of the land he had conquered. In a sense, he was adopting the civilization even as his armies occupied its cities. This marked the end of independent Mesopotamian political power, but it was not the end of Mesopotamian civilization. The culture, the knowledge, the ways of thinking that had developed over 3,000 years did not simply vanish because the government changed. The temples continued to function, the scribes continued to write, the old traditions carried on, gradually blending with the new influences brought by Persian rule. Babylon remained a great city for centuries more, though it would never again be the capital of its own empire. The last king of independent Mesopotamia had fallen, but the echoes of what had been created there would resound through all of subsequent history. And what echoes they were! Consider how much of what we take for granted in our world today has roots reaching back to those ancient cities between the rivers. The very concept of written law, the idea that rules should be codified and made public so that everyone knows what justice requires, this comes to us from Mesopotamia. When Hammurabi had his laws inscribed on stone and placed in public spaces, he established a principle that still guides our civilization. Later law codes, including those found in the Hebrew Bible, show clear influence from these earlier Mesopotamian precedents, sometimes borrowing specific provisions, always building on the foundation laid by those ancient lawmakers. The myths and stories of Mesopotamia traveled far beyond the boundaries of that land. The Epic of Gilgamesh, with its themes of friendship, mortality, and the search for immortality, has parallels in stories told around the world. The flood narrative, preserved in multiple Mesopotamian texts, appears with variations in the Bible and in the traditions of many cultures. The creation stories, the tales of gods and heroes, the wisdom literature, all of these spread through the ancient Near East, influencing the religious and literary traditions that would eventually shape Judaism, Christianity, and Islam. When we read ancient texts from neighboring cultures, we find Mesopotamian ideas, sometimes copied directly, sometimes adapted, but always present, like an underground river feeding multiple springs. In mathematics, the Mesopotamians left us gifts we use every single day. The division of the circle into 360 degrees, this is a Mesopotamian invention. The hour divided into 60 minutes, the minute into 60 seconds, this base 60 system comes from ancient Mesopotamia. When we tell time or measure angles, we are using a system developed on the banks of the Tigris and Euphrates thousands of years ago. Their mathematical sophistication extended far beyond timekeeping. They could solve complex algebraic problems, calculate the area of irregular shapes, work with fractions and large numbers. The place value notation system they developed, where the position of a digit determines its value, was a revolutionary concept that made complex calculations possible. Astronomy, too, owes an enormous debt to Mesopotamian observers who watched the night sky with patience and precision. They identified the planets, tracked their movements, predicted eclipses. They recognized that certain celestial events repeated in patterns, and they kept records over centuries to establish those patterns with accuracy. The zodiac, that band of constellations through which the sun appears to move, was defined by Mesopotamian astronomers. Many of our constellation names and the astrological traditions associated with them derive from their observations and interpretations. When later Greek astronomers systematized the study of the heavens, they built on Mesopotamian foundations, sometimes translating Mesopotamian texts directly, always acknowledging the debt they owed to these earlier skywatchers. But perhaps the most profound legacy of Mesopotamia is the very idea of civilization itself. Here, for the first time, we see all the elements coming together: cities with complex social organization, specialized labor, monumental architecture, writing, literature, science, law, organized religion, professional armies, international trade, bureaucratic administration. Mesopotamia showed that human beings could create something larger and more enduring than a tribe or village, that we could build societies that persisted across generations, that accumulated knowledge and refined it, that could transform the landscape itself to meet our needs. Every civilization that came after, in some way, learned from this first experiment in urban living. The Mesopotamians demonstrated that writing could preserve not just economic records but also poetry and prayers, jokes and wisdom, everything that makes us human. They showed that laws could create order and that justice could be systematically pursued. They proved that human ingenuity could harness nature through irrigation, that engineering could create wonders, that art could move the soul. They established that the stars could be understood through patient observation, that mathematics could unlock secrets of space and time. All of this, the entire toolkit of civilization as we know it, was first assembled in Mesopotamia. And so when we think of ancient Mesopotamia, we should think not just of ruins and artifacts, not just of long-dead kings and fallen empires, but of the living legacy that continues all around us. Every time we read a written law, check the time, look at the stars, solve a mathematical problem, read a story about heroes and gods, we are connecting with those ancient people who lived between the rivers. They could not have known how far their influence would reach, how long their ideas would endure. They built for their own time, for their own gods, for their own glory. But what they built transcended all of that, becoming the foundation upon which all subsequent civilizations would stand. The echoes of Mesopotamia have never faded, and perhaps they never will, because what was born there was not just a culture but the very idea that humanity could shape its own destiny, create its own meaning, and leave a legacy that outlasts any individual life or even any empire. In that sense, we are all inheritors of Mesopotamia, all children of those first cities between the rivers, all part of a story that began there so very long ago. And so, our story gently comes to a close. You don't need to hold on to anything you've heard. There's nothing to remember, and nothing to think about. If your eyes are already heavy, you can let them rest. If you drift off now, that's exactly as it should be. I'll be here with more gentle stories whenever you're ready. Good night, and rest well.